Hi everyone, my name is Thijs, Technical Evangelist at Varnish Software, and welcome to another video. This is episode 3 of Better Call Paul, a video series in which I call my colleague Paul and ask him a question. Today's question is about VSL queries. So let's see if he's available and give my colleague Paul a call. Hi Paul, I felt the need to call you again for the third time now. Let's turn this into a series, shall we? How are you doing?
Hello, Thijs. How are you doing? It's good to see you again.
Well, here's the question I'm going to have to ask you. But let's not fool anyone, right? We know the answers to the questions, but still we need to pretend like we don't know. The question is, what are VSL queries? So before we answer that, let's unpack that. VSL and queries. Queries means we're requesting something or filtering something, right? And then VSL, can you help me unpack that?
Well, the VSL is the Varnish Shared Memory Log that contains all of the information about all of the transaction in essence. And Varnish is writing to this log all the time, and you have various consumers that can show you what's in the log. And that's typically Varnish log if you are a developer, if you want all the information, or there's a summary in Varnish NCSA, which is a very useful tool to get the things that you care about. However,
Just for comparison, so Varnish log, as you can see here, is the verbose version of it, multi-line, all the information about the requests, the client information, the responses, potential backend fetches, backend responses, potential sub-requests, all the caching information, all the meta information, so that could go literally in the hundreds of lines for a single transaction. That's Varnish log. Varnish NCSA is the essential information packed into a single line in the NCSA combined format, which is a universal format that's used by nearly all the web servers. But behind the scenes, same engine, right?
indeed. Of course, Varnish NCSA can be configured to contain the things that you want. It's a very versatile tool, but of course, if you expect something that is just the standard format, you can get that as well.
Now, the fact that this is about VSL queries, we already explained what VSL is. It's shared memory. It's logs about transactions living in memory. It can be very busy, a lot of output. So querying would imply that we reduce the output. Now, in VSL, there's various ways of reducing output. One could go for rate limiting, where you limit the number of transactions based on a time factor. I've also worked a lot in situations where we only get out specific tags, specific log lines of those transactions. We have a very elaborate syntax as well, making it a lot less busy. But the problem, or the challenge, or whatever you want to call it, is that we're still getting all the transactions. And I think that's where the power lies of VSL queries. Isn't that right, Paul?
You said it quite well. I think so. As a user, you sometimes want to just look at a subset of your transactions. If you know there's a problem with a specific resource, for example, you can make a query that will only give you the logs, which is for fetches of that particular resource. And that lets you get not too much, but you can still get all of the details through Varnish log, which might tell you about what happened in VCL when we processed this request.
Give me a basic example. What would be a very basic way of filtering based on that query syntax? How would you explain that to our viewers?
Well, there's first of all you can as you can see on the screen, you can check if the URL is equal to a specific string. For example, the top resource of your site, which is just the slash URL or path.
The homepage, as we call it, right?
The homepage, yeah, that's probably what you call it.
And that's quite useful because it's no secret, I am very active on Stack Overflows, and when someone uses the hashtag Varnish, it comes into my mailbox. I try to respond, and in a lot of cases, people describe problems that are unique to a certain scenario, and I have to ask them a lot for very specific Varnish log queries. And assuming that the homepage is where the problem appears, rather than getting all the random output potentially for images that are not related, here's an example. ensure that the request URL we're matching equals, using this EQ, and then single quote / single quote to match that string. But it's, if we look at it from a million miles away in a more philosophic way, it is more abstract, right? There's a lot more that we can do than just match URLs.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that you can check in, and one of the typical examples is to check for any responses that have a high enough status code, for example, 500 and more, which indicates an error. What happened when this error happened? You can also use something which is not strictly about the VSL query, but which is also present in Varnish Log and Varnish and CSA, and that's the grouping. So if you use a group by request, you can get all of the sub-requests, so ESI sub-requests for a given URL. And that's quite interesting for people running newspapers, etc.
Yeah, because if we look at that, if you look at how transactions are structured, it all starts. So it's not a single transaction; it's a multitude of transactions that are linked. That you, as being the team lead for the C team in R&D, should be able to explain it, right? Is it correct for me to assume that these transactions reflect certain threads that operate independently? Is that a right assumption, or is it?
Well, of course, there's more to it than that. I'd like to say that if you have a well-functioning site, then there's only one transaction, and it's a cache hit. And that gives you the optimal fast path. And then it's just the thread that services the connection or a session, or, sorry, with H2, it's going to be the stream. And when you get a cache hit, you get it back, and that's a single transaction when grouping in these tools. Unless there's an ESI sub-request happening, then you have different transactions for each of the ESI elements. And that can give you something which is what you see here. But hopefully, again, you won't see the backend request for the ESI sub-request.
So real quick, what this means is, like, when a client connects for the first time to Varnish, it needs to establish a session. We can group on sessions and ensure that everything else is a subordinate resource, like the client request could be one of many requests that is made over this connection. If it's a cache miss, backend request needs to be made, backend response comes back. And then and this is why I'm showing you the audience this. Now we need to touch that ESI point. It could be that this specific ESI tag is mentioned in the code of the user, which triggers another request, a sub-request, an ESI sub-request, which makes us go deeper into the tree. And that sub-request will trigger a backend request, potentially, if it's not a cache hit, and so on and so forth, which makes sense from that level point of view. Like, if we look at the way we match, there is a level.
Yeah,
maybe you should pick up on this.
Yeah, you have the ESI sub request levels. So the basic usage of ESI is to have a resource that composes different sub requests into one big request, but you can have recursive ESI requests. So, if, for example, in a newspaper, you might have the site with all of the ads or special elements as a separate sub request, so that you can have one team composing this and another team composing the main content, which is in the middle. And then the slash resource is just composing these things together. But again, then you can have, for one of these teams, they might use ESI internally, and then you get a second level of ESI there as a result of this.
But that's not that mainstream, right? It happens, people do it, but in a lot of cases, people won't even specify the level. So if we look at this example here, we're trying to match a tag called timestamp, and there's many timestamps. So we're only, in this case, we only care about the response timestamp, which is the number of time it took to generate the response. But in this case, we care about ESI, so we're going for transactions that are level 2 or more. So that means initial ESI sub requests or recursive. Is that the word, right? Recursive ESI sub request?
I think it's the right word, but you know.
And if that doesn't go far enough for you, ladies and gentlemen, we don't just care about second level response timestamps. What we want to do is we want to match the second field. Maybe it's time to throw in an example here. Can you take our audience through this?
Yeah, this is very advanced querying. I mean, I'd like to say that the usual use case is when you know what the top is, and then you just want everything that happened as a result of this top request.
Exactly. So the level that we imply using those curly braces, you don't see it that often. It happens, but it's not.
In practice, you just want to see what happened with the specific URL and all of the sub requests that come with it. But of course, if you are more advanced like you are, Thijs, you might want to only look at the second level. And
well, to be perfectly honest, I didn't know about this, but then I wrote a book about Varnish during the COVID lockdowns. I had to do a lot of research and talk to a lot of people, engineers at Varnish, and then I figured out, it's an expression. There's levels to this game, but that applies to VSL as well. There's levels to that game as well.
Yes, and let's have a look at the example. So you talked about the different fields here, and the timestamps, they have a format that is composed of the Unix timestamp for for when a certain event happened, when the timestamp happened, and that's the number of seconds since 1st January 1970. And then you have two numbers. One is the number since the start of this transaction, and you can see that it goes up between the fetch and between the request and the fetch, and that's because it took about 7 milliseconds to carry out the bit that is between these two times, and that's the last parameter. And the second parameter is the time since the transaction started.
So what you're basically saying is that the second field accumulates with more timestamps taking place, whereas the last field is just that unit of work, the time it took.
Yeah, it's the delta, essentially.
So if we take that information, turn it into an actual query, this could be one, right? So we only care about the URL and the timestamp for, in this case, second level timing information where we match a response timestamp where the second field is more than 2.0. Pretty much give me the URL and the timing for everything that took longer than 2 seconds.
Yeah, it's very specific. And that's the power of the query language, that you can compose these things. You can also do an and or an or and several other things.
Yeah, let's throw those in. So you can combine multiple ones by using and. What if you do multiple minus q's? Is that an and or an or?
Can you even do that?
I think you can. Okay. I think it's an and, but I'm not sure.
I think you just do one query and then you do the next query on the result, what survived the first one, essentially.
Well, that's a very interesting point. And we're glancing over it so casually. It's like, yeah, you take the result and then you do another query. I think it requires a little bit more time. Please, Paul, explain what you mean with that.
Well, if I may, I'd also like to mention the fact that it's related to this. When you do Varnish Log, when you run Varnish Log, you can have a query on the capture of the log records. So you might not want to write all of the information. You might just want to write the information about some requests. And then you get a binary file, which you can then read again in Varnish Log or Varnish NCSA or Varnish Top, for example. And then you can add another query, and then you only filter the transaction that you have captured. So that makes it an AND operation. You need to satisfy the first query to get into the file, and then you need to satisfy the second query to actually get display on the screen.
And that requires a set of other parameters that we didn't mention yet. If you want to write stuff away to disk, you probably need the -w parameter. And if you want to append that, you want the -a parameter there as well. And then you store it on disk. If you want to read it, you can take that file and put it back into Varnish Log with -r. that brings it back in. And then again, you can do some queries after the fact. But I guess the answer is no, but I'll need you to confirm it. If you already reduced the information using tag filtering, you probably can't match on other stuff, right? The information that
Yes.
is there is your base.
Yeah, the filtering that you do when you create the file is kind of limiting what you can do with the information later on, because that's the only thing that you do store in the file. Then
Right.
maybe,
So before we end, because we're already pretty far into this, is I want to talk about the different operators that we have. Like we saw the earlier on, we saw EQ as a way to match things, but there's more than equaling a string, right? What else can we do?
well, you can do equals equals, which is the standard way for C-type languages to check if numeric values are the same.
Does that only
So,
apply to integers or also to floating point numbers?
good question. I think.
This is a real question. This is not me knowing the answer and pretending I don't.
Oh, dang
This is a
it.
real question. Like
I don't know either right now. It's a good question. I think.
I would assume floating points would work as well. I would assume. We can
Yeah,
always test it afterwards.
but testing floating point numbers for equality is basically you get a no as an answer. They are never equal if there are measurements of time, for example, which is the typical floating point number in Varnish log. It's a timestamp or a time delta, and it's going to have a lot of decimals in the binary representation. So testing for equality is
We
never
did some
meaningful.
comparisons with larger than or equal or smaller than or equal. That's easier, right? And you see it on the screen here. You can. This is an example where we're checking backend response statuses if it's more than 500 or equal or less than. But here's an interesting one as well using the tilde. So if you look at this example, what does it do?
Well, it checks if there is a recurrel line in the Varnish log that satisfy a particular regular expression. And this example here is, does the recurrel start with slash contact?
And it
And
could match multiple URLs, right? Contacts with an S, contact slash
yes,
whatever.
and it's even more advanced than that, because during VCL processing you might change the URL in several steps, and then if one of these regular URL lines is satisfying this regular expression, then it will hit, or it will go through the filter, which means that it's not checking the final or the initial value of this variable, which is a variable inside of Varnish, but just if there is one. And you also have the not tilde, so bang tilde operator.
Yeah, so that's
which,
exclamation mark tilde.
yes.
Speaking of not, you also have the keyword not. That's a confusing one, or that was at least a confusing one.
That's where I was going. Yeah. So the point is that if you do the not tilde, it looks for any line where you do not match the regular expression, but that does not give you the same result as not and then the expression with the tilde, and that's a huge gotcha. Yes, I mean,
So
and
if you would have
sometimes
to define what adding the not keyword to a header you're matching or a tag you're matching in the VSL, does it mean it's not supposed to be present, or is it more broader than that?
no, it's a logical not, so it turns true into false and false into true.
Okay, so
So
your answer is it's a bit broader than that. So if you do an
yeah,
expression and you put the not keyword in front of it, it's basically the inverse Boolean
yeah,
result.
and sometimes you need to use not and then an expression which contains the not tilde to get what you want, and that's that's really advanced stuff. You might want to give an example or just cut this entirely from the video.
Well, I think this is a great way to summarize. You've seen dear viewers, that there is a level of complexity there, but complexity is not necessarily a challenge or a problem. It's a feature. It's a feature, not a bug, right? We give you tremendous amount of insight in what's going on in the execution flow of Varnish, and thanks to that very expansive query language, you're able to match exactly what you want. And it's part of a larger story. Varnish Log or VSL in general allows you to get insight on exactly what you want. Any closing statements on that, Paul, before we end?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, but I'd like to make an additional point. So, in practice, what you do is that you have a Varnish log file that contains everything that might be interesting, and then you look, oh, this is too much. Let's limit this somehow, and then you do a query, and you get less, and then you find something else that you're not interested in, and you expand the query, and finally you get to a set of transactions that are interesting. So you don't have to get everything right in the first try. You can work your way there to a query that works for you for that specific use case.
And there was another point we talked about before we started recording, is that the scope of VSL queries is bigger than just Varnish Log, Varnish Top, Varnish NCSA. I think as a super advanced example or point before we end the video, I'd really like you to briefly hit on that.
Yes, so there's these tools that we mention all the time, Varnish Log, Varnish NCSA. They use a library, which is the Varnish libvarnish API, and that is where the code for the queries are. So if you are really advanced and you need to have a tool that reads the Varnish Log or VSL, then you can use this library and you can get the query language for free by using the API. So yeah, it's quite powerful and it makes it easier to write these tools, which is of course quite difficult in the first place. So it's nice to get some help from the API.
And that being said, Paul, again, I would like to thank you for taking the time to elaborate on this. It's a fun conversation. And to the viewers, if you found this interesting, we'll put some resources in the description of this video so that you can venture out on your own. There is a very expansive tutorial about how to use VSL, including the VSL queries, on our developer portal. And we're also linking to some open source documentation about the specs of VSL query and the tools. So that being said, thank you for watching. Thank you, Paul, for helping me out. I'll see you again next time.
Thank you.